The streets hold many secrets. From alleyways in the heart of London to the quietest country lane, they've all witnessed cruelty and violence, jealousy and despair. They've seen crimes of passion and cold-hearted murder. They've seen killers escape and killers brought to justice. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious crimes and intriguing mysteries. Stories of men and women who killed, of the police who hunted them, and the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and far beyond, this is the dark history of our streets. He was the legendary lawman of Prohibition America, the man who brought down Al Capone. But in 1938, Eliot Ness had a problem. He was safety director in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, and a serial killer was at large. For almost 4 years, police had been receiving the calls. Headless bodies were found in lakes and rivers, under bridges and in backyards. The victims often went unidentified. The killer always escaped undetected.
The pattern is so incoherent. You've got a package of murders which target individuals with no clear commonality.
The victims were mutilated while they were still alive, and body parts were scattered.
Sometimes it almost had echoes of Jack the Ripper. It was a very difficult case for the police to solve. There didn't seem to be anything linking them, apart from the fact that they were connected with a ramshackle shantytown.
But Ness had a suspect, and in late May 1938, he seized him off the streets for questioning. For a week, he held the man at a downtown Cleveland hotel. The interview was never officially recognized as having taken place. Its results were never released. But that secret interrogation spawned a legend that Eliot Ness had identified the man behind some of the most disturbing crimes in American history. The man newspapers called the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The 1930s were a hard time for Cleveland. It was the Great Depression. Unemployment among industrial workers hit 50%. The ranks of the poor and homeless multiplied.
Cleveland, like Chicago, like so many of the Midwest cities, was a city still severely affected by the Great Depression. It was lacking the industrial heart, the great steel industries that had seen it flourish, that had seen it a city of wealth and prosperity.
The charities, normally dealing with sort of homelessness and poverty, they couldn't cope. There was just too much distress.
Cities like Cleveland always have slum areas, but of course these had increased and new areas had gone economically downhill since the Depression.
Even those who kept their jobs saved money where they could. On the 5th of September 1934, a man walked along the shore of Lake Erie looking for driftwood to burn. Shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning, he spotted something. At first, he thought it was a tree trunk washed up on the beach, but when he got closer, he realized he was wrong.
It was a good area for the disposition of bodies. You could take them down to the lake and hope to dispose of the body successfully. In this case, it didn't work.
The body was not intact, only the bottom half was found. She'd obviously been dismembered. There was evidence of knife cuts.
What had been particularly gruesome, which had seen the body actually taken some notice of in the local press, was the fact that a chemical had been used which turned the skin into a sort of reddish colour, kind of tanning almost.
The police searched the lake, but they didn't find the woman's missing head or hands or anything else they could use to identify her, nor could detectives match the body with any woman reported missing. With no other clues, the investigation soon ended, the case unsolved. What police did not know was that this was just the beginning. In late September 1935, just over a year after the discovery of the lady in the lake, 2 teenage boys were playing catch near an industrial wasteland known as Kingsbury Run.
Kingsbury Run had once been one of the delightful and desirable areas on the fringes of Cleveland. Wooded, pleasant walks, dramatic local scenery, everything like that.
It had really gone downhill. We're talking about the years of the Depression in America. It had industrial landscape, crisscrossed with railways.
With so many homeless coming into Cleveland, looking for work or looking for accommodation, you have shantytowns building up. And one of those shantytowns was Kingsbury Run.
The 2 teenagers tossed their ball back and forth until a wayward throw sent one of them scampering to the bottom of a hill. That is where the next bodies were found. Lying among the weeds and bushes, quite unhidden, were 2 dead men.
The 2 bodies were found close together. Both of them had been mutilated, and the heads of the 2 men were buried nearby.
There was no particular sort of signs of blood where the body was found, so it appeared that they had been murdered somewhere else. They were in locations where You couldn't have unloaded it from a car. It had to have been somebody quite strong to have carried the bodies to the burial place.
And of course, one of the things that added gruesome sensationalism to all of this was the fact that as part of the dismemberment of the torsos, the males had been castrated.
The bodies were transported to the morgue. Autopsies revealed one of the men had been dead for over a week, the other for just 2 or 3 days. The younger victim had still been alive when his head was removed. A major investigation began at once. 3 months later, as inquiries continued, Eliot Ness began work as Cleveland's new safety director. The city already had a reputation for crime and violence. As 1936 began, it was about to get even worse. Cleveland had never seen anything quite like it. 2 bodies had been found in Kingsbury Run, an industrial wasteland south of the city center. The men had been decapitated and emasculated, their bodies stripped and cleaned. As the police investigation began, the mystery only deepened. Where had the men been killed? Where had their bodies been stored? How did they end up at the bottom of the hill? And why were they targeted in the first place? One of the victims was quickly identified by his fingerprints. His name was Edward Andrassy. The 29-year-old Clevelander was already known to the police. He was a drinker, a brawler, a ladies' man.
He was a dealer in drugs and alcohol, and he was a bit of a nuisance to the police. He would often sort of cause them problems, so he was well known to the police.
He was essentially a gigolo type. So that makes him a credible target. A sexual motive was very clearly there, so that could help to explain a castration.
Most murder victims know their killers, so police questioned Andrassy's friends and family. They trawled through his complicated personal life. They uncovered rumors of secret homosexuality, but no suspects.
The police didn't seem to be getting anywhere with their inquiries.
In fact, it was thought for a time that possibly he had been killed as a result of sort of one of his affairs.
What is interesting and telling, I think, is that there is no attempt to link those 2 murders with the dismembered torso murder from the previous year. It's only retrospectively that it's been speculated that the same hand was involved.
Early in the new year of 1936, another body was found. In the snowbound yard of a factory on East 20th Street, police discovered 2 baskets. Wrapped in newspaper and stuffed into the baskets were half a woman's torso, 2 thighs, an arm, and a hand. 2 weeks later, melting snow revealed the rest of her body dumped a few blocks away. Only the head remained missing. Again, police extracted fingerprints, and again, they matched them to a name.
Her name was Florence Polillo. She'd lived in various places in Buffalo, in Erie, which is further along the coast of the lake. But again, she'd fallen on hard times.
She'd been married twice, she was alcoholic. She had convictions for soliciting and dealing in liquor.
Police examined Polillo's friends and acquaintances. They tracked her final movements, but again, they were frustrated. Her murder was a puzzle they couldn't solve. Detectives were not yet formally linking the killings, but in the summer of 1936, all that would change. On June the 5th, two boys skipped school to go fishing, and walking through Kingsbury Run, they spotted a bundle of clothing discarded under a tree. They poked at it with their fishing rods, and the bundle separated, revealing the decapitated head of a young man. The following day, his body was found just a few hundred yards away, close in fact to where Edward Andrassy and the still unidentified older man had been dumped.
The head was photographed. This was reproduced in the newspapers in the hope that somebody would be able to identify him. Not only was the photograph published, but the head was actually put on display in the morgue so that people could actually go and look at the head to see if they could identify the man.
It was certainly assumed that the tattooed man would be easy to identify.
He had a number of tattoos on his body. He had a butterfly tattoo. He had the names Paul and Helen tattooed on his body, and he had other tattoos on his legs and ankles.
This, of course, created a lot of publicity, but it still didn't result in anybody identifying the man.
I think it's explainable because extensive tattooing was associated with either being a sailor, i.e. somebody who may or may not have been American, or with criminality. And that would mean that people who might actually have known who the tattooed man was would not wish to come forward to identify him.
Two more victims would be found that summer. In July, the headless body of a man was discovered in woods on Cleveland's west side. He'd been dead for 2 months. Then, in September, a man's severed torso was fished out of a stagnant waterway in Kingsbury Run. Neither victim was ever identified. There could be no doubt now the murders were linked. One killer was responsible, but police were no closer to an arrest. The press and the public were getting impatient.
A lot of the press coverage wasn't necessarily very accurate, and of course things started to run out of control of the police.
As the number of victims grew, the press became more and more critical of the police and their failure to actually sort of identify this man. They had called the murderer Fiend, the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run.
The presumption promoted by the papers is that they are the same hand. There's enough evidence for them to capitalise on the idea that they are the same hand. And so they keep Cleveland in a state of alarm.
The authorities had to act. On September the 15th, they called an emergency conference. More than 30 detectives and scientists gathered at the Central Police Station to share their theories about the killer, and the press was invited along to watch.
The conference that the coroner held to clarify exactly what was known and how you could link crimes together and decide whether they were properly series of crimes or not was an early form of case conference. It would be standard practice now for investigating officers to get together to determine the strands of investigations that were common. And of course they didn't have computers to link together the information. They didn't have the advantages that a modern detective force backed up by forensic science would have had.
The conclusion of the conference was that the murderer obviously knew the area well. He was also used to handling knives, and this is evidence from the dismembering of the bodies.
He had to be strong because he carried the victims to the place where they'd been buried, and they realised that he must probably have had some medical knowledge because of the way that the bodies had been cut up and dismembered.
Possibly it was suggested he was a butcher, a hunter, or a doctor.
Among those at the conference were two men not yet formally attached to the case. Soon, however, Safety Director Eliot Ness and Detective Peter Murillo would be leading the investigation into the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. For one of the men, the case would become an obsession he could never let go. For the other, it would be a stain on his reputation he could never erase. It was September the 10th, 1936, when Peter Murillo got the call. He'd been selected by the Chief of Police to take over the investigation into the torso killings. Murillo had been in the department for 17 years, but he'd never faced anything quite like this.
Peter Murillo was, at that time, one of the Cleveland Police Department's more successful detectives, and he is particularly well qualified.
He came from the Ukraine. He emigrated to America when he was a teenager. He joined the police force after World War I, and since 1931 he'd been a detective.
He was known to be very efficient, quite blunt and outspoken, and sometimes a little bit unconventional, but he was a good detective.
He also has the great advantage of speaking several East European languages, because the speculation was, is this targeting foreigners? He can therefore pick up gossip, talk to people, and hope to pick up clues as to the identities of the torsos.
Murillo was not the only newcomer to the case that September. The city's safety director, Eliot Ness, was personally ordered by the mayor of Cleveland to oversee the investigation, and he was soon under pressure to get results.
Thanks to the sensationalism of the reportage in the Cleveland press, you've got a panicked Cleveland society demanding that the police do something. So the mayor of Cleveland says to Ness, I want you to solve this, to take charge, to do something.
And the first thing Ness did was call Murillo into the office and say, how far have you got? What are you doing?
Ness seemed to have recruited his own special team of investigators to undertake their own inquiry. These days, a criminal investigation of this sort would be structured very carefully so that you had sort of roles clearly defined. There doesn't seem to be much of that.
He has his own hand-picked investigative team. These detectives would report only to him. So you have two lines of inquiry running.
It seems that not all of what they found out was relayed to Peter Murillo. And you speculate, well, perhaps his background in Chicago wasn't necessarily the background that gave him the skills to undertake a major investigation when you didn't know who the suspect was.
They didn't share all the resources and information. Ness certainly kept stuff back from Murillo, so there is a possible conflict here between the two lines of investigation.
It was an approach which had served Ness well in the past. During his years as a prohibition agent, Ness had operated a small team of men he could trust. The press would call them the Untouchables.
In Chicago, it was virtually impossible to find a police officer who was not in some way tainted. So Ness recognized that if he was going to be successful, he had to gather around him a body, even if only a very, very small body, of those whom he could trust.
He was such a thorn in Capone's side that one of Capone's henchmen offered him a bribe, laid two $1,000 bills on his desk and said the same every Monday if you back off. $2,000 in today's currency is worth about $35,000. So he was being offered that as a bribe every week. He never touched it. They couldn't be bribed, they couldn't be corrupted, and they passed into legend.
They were admirable men because the temptation from their colleagues, from their way of life, will have been enormous.
It's said that by the time of Al Capone's eventual arrest, Eliot Ness and his team had taken out about $9 million worth of value from Al Capone's operations. In fact, one of the main planks of why Al Capone was arrested was because they proved the amount of money going through his organisation. He eventually got 11 years imprisonment for tax evasion. And that actually sort of broke the power of his organisation.
But breaking the bootleggers and mobsters of Chicago was one thing. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run was another. The killer had not been deterred by Murillo's investigation or the secret operation of Eliot Ness. He'd been busy. In February 1937, the torso of another unidentified woman washed up on the shores of Lake Erie. In June, a burlap sack of bones was discovered under a bridge. The victim was an African-American woman who'd been killed as much as a year earlier. Then, exactly a month after her remains were found, the headless body of a man was pulled out of the Cuyahoga River.
The police would have been looking for a pattern, if you like, amongst the victims. Yeah, there was men as well as women, one black woman, most of the rest were white.
It's unusual for killers to do this, black and white, male and female. This, again, is somewhat unorthodox in criminal investigation.
They only were able to identify two of the victims. That made it more difficult. There wasn't a pattern that was sufficiently clear to point to a kind of suspect or a good line of inquiry.
Murillo's investigation was tireless. He pursued every possible lead, every missing person report, any report of suspicious behavior. But with each new murder, he found himself asking the same questions and getting the same unsatisfactory answers. Only two of the victims had ever been identified. Police returned to the stories of Edward Andrassy and Florence Polillo again and again, hoping to find some overlooked clue, some unexpected connection, but they found nothing. Despite all of Murillo's work, he was no closer to cracking the case. The detective was convinced that the killer was riding the railways, mixing among the hobo population and picking his victims from among them. For years, Murillo pestered his superiors to approve a more unorthodox approach. And by June 1940, the killer's tally had reached 12. Finally, the detective's request was granted.
With the exception of these two individuals, Andrassy and Flo Polizzo, the anonymity of the remaining 10 convinces Murillo that they're not from Cleveland, that they are drifters, hitching lifts on the trains, legally or illegally.
People would live in railway wagons, boxcars as they call them. There was a murder very similar that had happened in Newcastle, which was further up the railway line.
Murillo's task is to go into the levels of society from which it is presumed these torsos come, riding the trains, seeing if he can spot a likely suspect or indeed a likely victim.
Murillo's odyssey along the railroads of Ohio proved fruitless. What he didn't know was that his superior, Eliot Ness, already had a suspect. A man Ness had questioned in a hotel suite more than 2 years earlier. A man his team had kept under surveillance ever since. A man Ness believed was the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The man was drunk. When Ness and his men bundled him into the suite at the Cleveland Hotel, he could barely stand. For days, he lay in bed, drying out. The door was guarded, the room was watched, because Eliot Ness was convinced the man on the bed was the killer he was looking for, the man whose grisly work had been scattered across the city. Finally, after 3 days, the man sobered up. The most extraordinary interview of Eliot Ness's career could begin.
The investigators were sworn to secrecy about this man. It was clear that he did have a kind of a schizoid sort of personality. He'd been a severe alcoholic, he had drugs problems.
The interrogation lasted some 7 days, and during this time, the man was given polygraph testing, lie detector test, and according to the tester, Ness had got his man. It was completely unorthodox and completely unofficial.
The identity of the man in the hotel room was a mystery for decades. Whether the interview even took place was doubted. For years, nobody who was present spoke of it, but recently, the truth has emerged. The suspect's name was Francis Edward Sweeney. He was a doctor, an alcoholic, and a likely paranoid schizophrenic.
He was born in 1894. He went to medical school and qualified when he was about 26, 27 years old, went into practice. But he was a sort of a psychiatric case almost from the beginning. He got married and because of his behavior, threatened violence towards his wife. She divorced him in 1934.
During all these years of police investigations, obviously there were suspects. One homeless man described how a doctor had offered him a meal and a new pair of shoes. But when he had been eating, all of a sudden he started to feel very lightheaded, as if he were being poisoned, and the man ran away.
From his description of the surgery where he'd been taken, this fitted Dr. Sweeney's surgery. A surgery was also adjacent to a mortuary, so if the body needed to be cut up, there was obviously one right at hand.
It was all circumstantial evidence, but a more compelling suspect has never been found. Ness was certain of the man's guilt, but he had no proof. The polygraph test was not admissible in court, and Detective Murillo had long struggled with the lack of witnesses and physical evidence. And there was another complication as well.
Undoubtedly, what Ness hoped to do was to advertise that he'd got a suspect and thereby diffuse the critical press coverage.
Now, in logic, what should have happened was that it was turned into a formal investigation. Perhaps that if Francis Sweeney's house had been searched, perhaps there might be evidence of some sort there.
Until he discovered that, unfortunately, Sweeney had a cousin who was a congressman and who was certainly not going to be happy to see his family name smeared, and so he has to back off.
So there was some politics involved. Eliot Ness, despite this fact of strongly suspecting him, he didn't take any further action. Whether in fact politics played a part in how he dealt with this inquiry, we're not quite sure. But it does seem a very strange method of investigation.
If he couldn't take the murderer down, Ness thought, he could at least make life more difficult for him. It had long been thought that the butcher was targeting the homeless and destitute of Kingsbury Run. The dark anonymity of the shantytown was the perfect place to find victims and dump their bodies afterwards. Ness wanted to close that hunting ground. In the early hours of August the 18th, 1938, he made his move.
Ness decides that, okay, if I can't arrest anybody, what I can do is a form of what might be called extreme slum clearance.
In 1938, 2 years after being appointed to the investigation, Eliot Ness actually led a raid on Kingsbury Run shantytown.
He's going to go in there, arrest anybody he can hold for a while on the basis of any criminal activity that he can uncover, and he manages to accumulate around 63 for that purpose, and then raze the shanty towns to the ground. Literally a burnt earth policy. He burns them down.
Ness's idea behind this, a somewhat brutal solution, was that this would deprive the murderer of a source for his victims.
The burning of Kingsbury Run and the other shantytown areas causes Cleveland for a while a very, very real resettlement and rehousing problem, and it doesn't actually bring about an arrest or anything that might be held to justify it.
The newspapers and the public were unimpressed, but the safety director was not finished yet. A few days later, he dispatched detectives like Peter Murillo into the houses and tenements surrounding the run. A legal loophole allowed fire wardens to inspect properties without search warrants. Ness took advantage of that by pairing his men with the wardens, and his team scoured the neighborhood for any sign of the butcher. But before Ness could complete the operation, the press heard about his ruse, and the searchers were called off. The safety director had hoped to uncover the physical proof they'd been missing, but once again, he had failed.
Ness never recovers from his failure in Cleveland. His first marriage breaks up, subsequent marriages are not successful.
There were embarrassing incidents. On one occasion he was involved in a car accident, and instead of waiting to deal with it, jumped out of the car and ran away, which of course brought a lot of public criticism on his head.
When he later actually tries to come back to Cleveland and to say, look, I really reformed your police, now elect me mayor and I can do more for you. I mean, that attempt to run for mayor ends in a humiliating defeat for Ness. He is a man largely forgotten, considered in many ways, rightly, the author of his own downfall.
One of the great ironies of Ness's life is that, having waged war on Prohibition and on Al Capone's bootlegging, Ness himself died as an acute alcoholic. He was only 57 when he died.
Eliot Ness's reputation in Cleveland was poisoned by the Torso case. He died in 1957. In the decades afterwards, his life and exploits would be the subject of books, television series, and films. He would become a legend. But no such acclaim would come the way of Detective Peter Murillo. He led the official investigation into the killings until his retirement in 1943. His unofficial inquiries would continue the rest of his life. He never believed Francis Sweeney was the killer, but nor could he identify a more likely suspect. Sweeney died in 1964 after decades in and out of psychiatric hospitals. If he was the killer, he took his secrets with him to the grave.
He hounded Ness for the rest of Ness's life, sending him letters, postcards, strange messages and such. He never let Ness out of his sight.
Sweeney checks himself into a mental asylum, remaining there, in fact, until he dies, which has convinced some people that he probably was the Torso murderer, because you don't get any more murders after, so they make a correlation which certainly wouldn't stand up in a court of law.
Perhaps Francis Edward Sweeney was the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Or perhaps he was just an alcoholic, unhappy and disturbed. It's unlikely we shall ever know. After August 1938, the grim and all too regular discoveries in Cleveland stopped. But the mysteries that surround the killings remain. Most of the victims lie in nameless graves, their murders forever unsolved, their stories forever untold.